Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 1. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear, or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? Why do you look idly at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For, behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress. For they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on. And guilty men whose own might is their God. Let's pray. Oh God, we need your help to understand your word. Thank you for your spirit that you give to everybody who asks. So we ask now that your spirit would do a work among us through the preaching of your word that you only know we need. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. You all can be seated. Donna has taken the children's class with her. If you're in that class, then feel free to go with her. So, murder, addiction, sexual sin, hatred, those four are reasons why we should read and study the book of Habakkuk. He was a prophet who was prophesied after the northern kingdom of Israel had already fallen, so Judah was in the midst of a vast spiritual decline. So Habakkuk knows what it's like to live in a nation that declines spiritually. And in the midst of all of this spiritual apathy and aggression towards sin, his question is, why doesn't God intervene? Why doesn't God intervene? That's him. And so some of you may just count us out to start with. It's in the Old Testament. It's a minor prophet. So I'm going to give minor attention to it. But minor just means it's less in volume than the major prophets. But it's still the Word of God. But here is why we need to pay attention, why we need to understand the book of Habakkuk. In our country, there are around 20 million people who are addicted to drugs and alcohol. That's people that are counted, right? So they're in and out of rehab. Meanwhile, the baby boomer generation is raising their grandkids. And the people my age are treated like siblings to their kids, as opposed to the mom and dad who should take responsibility. The people my age are the siblings of their children, as opposed to the parents of their children. The people raising their children are the next generation up. Yes. That's what we're dealing with. There's another Holocaust in our country since 1973. 61.5 million, over that, have been killed in the womb in our nation. Do you realize that that is slightly less than the whole population of the United Kingdom? We've killed the population of the United Kingdom since 1973 in this country. How many generations of people is that are not among us today because we killed them? Christians stand against things like that. They stand against gay marriage, and the opposition comes back and says, this is all we want, give us this much and we'll be satisfied. And we say, yeah, but if you change marriage like this, then where does it ever end, and whatever happens to marriage? And they say, that's a slippery slope argument, that legalizing gay marriage will lead to anything else. We don't want it to, we just want this to happen. That's the argument. And then, last week in the state of Utah, senators voted to decriminalize polygamy. Because it really is never going to end. Because marriage, gender, those things actually don't mean anything to anybody anymore. So, what we've done is taken the fabric of our society and thrown it into a wood chipper. So if you think for one moment that this place, this nation, is a Christian nation, you are not paying attention. It is absolutely not a Christian nation. Look at the world. Look at our land. That is why we need to study the book of Habakkuk. Because we need to learn to trust God when we are frustrated by the broken world and the sinful world that we're around. As one pastor described this book, he said that this is like a call-in show in which that God is taking calls, and who's the next caller up? It's Habakkuk. Habakkuk asks him questions, and God responds to his question. Don't you wish that God had a call-in show for you? You'd call him, wouldn't you? And you'd ask him some things. Well, we look at the book of Habakkuk today as an inside view of Habakkuk's questions and answers from God. So, if you look at verse 1, we have a one-sentence introduction just so we know what this is. This is the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. The King James translates it, this is the burden. So an oracle or a burden, it reminds us that what we're getting ready to look at today is heavy stuff. These aren't easy questions to think through. Habakkuk talks to God about them, and his message to the prophet is weighty. One, because it's a message from God to start with, but two, he deals with the most foundational questions in all of life. So here's question number 1 for us today. Why doesn't God do something about the evil in the world? That's the question that Habakkuk asks to start this whole thing. Now, here's his complaint in verse 2. He says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save?" So, what he's doing is he says, "O Lord," meaning the covenant name of God. This is the special name that God revealed himself to his people. So it's significant that the prophet uses it and says, "O covenant God who's made a covenant relationship with us, O you who is our God, how long are you not going to listen to us and not help us?" In other words, if anybody should listen to me, it should be you, God, because you're my God. So you ought to listen when I pray, because you say you do, and you say you will. So he says, how long am I going to have to cry for help? And aren't we like that too, right? We think if God's going to answer anybody's prayers or hear anybody, then we've been a good little boy and a good little girl this year, right? He's going to come to our house, put stuff under our tree, put stuff in our stockings. But that's exactly what Habakkuk says. And here's his problem. How long do I have to keep crying out to you for you to do something about it? So there's two accusations that we see here in this verse. It says either God will not listen or he will not act. How long do I have to keep crying for help and you're not hearing this? Or how long do I have to cry violence and you're not saving us? Isn't this what the things we deal with? Like, do you feel like God has heard you every time you've prayed? Or are there times you've prayed and you just don't feel like he's listening? You feel like you're talking to yourself as opposed to reaching the throne of grace boldly, that you draw near and you find grace and help in time of need. Yeah, those things are true, but we get in situations in our lives when we're right here in Habakkuk. We're saying, God, why don't you hear what I'm saying? Or why don't you do something about what I'm saying? So the two accusations, either you're not listening or you're not doing. You're not doing or you're not listening. This is frustration. But what this also is this is Habakkuk with no patience. It's already gone. So his ultimate accusation to God is, you should have done something by now, but you haven't done anything yet. God, you should have done something by now, but you didn't. How many of us are there today? Either God's not listening, he's not acting, but either way, this thing should have already happened. This healing should have already come. This child should have already come. This job should have already come. So you might be wearing the prophet's t-shirt today. You might be in the same place that he is. Here's his ultimate two complaints about his situation, right? He complains about God, you're not listening, and you're not doing, and then he complains about a situation, and he says this: the world is not right. The world is not right.
Amen.
If you're from Moorhead, it ain't right. Right? If it's from Moorhead, the world ain't right. And you know it ain't right. You know it's not. So, in the midst of this complaint, he sees 6 things that he's fed up with. Let me just air some of his dirty laundry out for you all and see if you have any of the same laundry in your basket. First thing Habakkuk sees in verse 3, he says, why do you make me see iniquity? 1, he makes him see sin. He makes him see sin. If you don't look out your window, turn on your TV, and you don't see sin, you don't know what sin is. Right? If you don't see it, you don't know what it is. Because the prophet looked out and saw it everywhere. People living like they ain't got no mama. That is what he saw in the world. They're living disregarding and overstepping any bound that God may put on them. We see sin and suffering. Secondly, he says, you're making me see sin and you're looking idly by it wrong. This is two sides of the same coin. There is a victim and there is a perpetrator of that said sin. There is a perpetrator who sins and a victim who suffers because of the sin. That's what I see. That's what I see outside. So the question he brings out in verse 3, he says, why do you look idly at wrong? Meaning, you're making me look at this stuff in the beginning of verse 3. And then in the second phrase of verse 3, he says, but you look idly at wrong. So, God, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Because I trust you that you're in charge of what's on my screen. You make me look idly at wrong. You're in charge of everything I see. I believe that. But if that's the case, then are you seeing what I'm seeing? That is what he's doing. Because in our world, there appears to be natural evil, natural disasters, hurricanes, typhoons, earthquakes, and the like. But then there appears to be senseless evil in the world, and most of it, actually all of it, we're personally responsible for.
Yes.
This is something that we do to each other, or have done to us.
Amen.
That's what he's talking about. So verse 3, he sees sin, suffering, destruction, violence. Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. As one commentator put it, destruction and violence, this is something that describes unjust oppression of the weak.
Yes.
In their society. Do we oppress the weak in our society?
Yes.
Do we really care about poor people? Do we really care about poor people, or do we just get mad at them and blame them for being poor? Are you poor or just ignorant? Or both? Right? We get mad at poor people for being poor. We get mad at broken people for being broken.
That's right.
That's what this society did. There's destruction and violence all around. Boy, do we do this. Right? I mentioned abortion. That if you're too young, that we might just kill you, depending on who you are. Not just that. If you're too old, we might kill you. Because in 10 states, there is medically assisted suicide. So if somebody's too old and not contributing to the society, we can put them down like a dog at the vet. Because we don't care about life. If you're too young, too old, too much with special needs, we'll abuse you if you're alive, and we might cause your death. I work with mentally handicapped people and people with special needs, and the percentage of abuse, both physically and sexually and emotionally, in that population is astronomical.
Yes.
Because we respond to the defenseless with offense towards them. Well, that picture is what Habakkuk sees out of his window. He saw sin and suffering, destruction and violence. Fifth and sixthly, strife and contention. People were angry with each other, fighting to climb a ladder. This shows, right? Strife shows competing wills. Wills, not wheels. Competing wills. My will is different from yours. Have you ever been on Twitter or read the comments in a YouTube section? If you've ever seen those things, you will think way less of humanity.
Yes.
Because the internet is full of nothing but trolls. People are angry at each other. And this describes legal battles, as one commentator put it. The CSB translates it saying that conflict escalates. We're mad at each other. People prey on us being mad at each other. And they divide us even more.
Yes, amen. Amen.
They make big money on people being mad at each other. You make big money on war. Make big money on segregating populations of the society. You make big money on that kind of stuff. Just make them mad enough at each other so they don't talk. That was the world of Habakkuk. Who did you think I was talking about? What world did you think I was talking about? Because I'm talking about Habakkuk. I'm talking about our world. Because the world hasn't changed since Habakkuk. In fact, his complaint about his first complaint and his question of why won't God do something about evil is the world ain't right. The world is not right. Excuse me. So, shouldn't someone do something about the world? Shouldn't somebody do something about this?
Yes.
Maybe the government. Here's what the government does in verse 4. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth.
That's right.
For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. So here's the government's response to the wrong in the world. Nothing. Really nothing. They're doing things, justice is going forth, but it's perverted and twisted and wrong. So here's what we learn from his question about God is one, the world ain't right. The world isn't right. I have to fix that, right? The world is not right, and the government is not king.
That's right.
The government is not king in verse 4. Here's the government's response to what's wrong in the world. We're talking about the government of Judah. One, they ignore the law. They ignore it. Two, there is no justice. So the law was given primarily through Levitical priests and leaders at that time. But at this point, here's how effective it is. He says it's paralyzed. It does not have the life and vigor in it that it should have. Because the law is ignored and paralyzed, justice never goes forth, it never happens. Here's the results of that. Wickedness is abounding, and crooked leadership, according to verse 4. So the wicked surround the righteous, and justice goes out twisted. So what's happening in Habakkuk's day is the same thing that's happened in the whole story of the Old Testament. 1 Kings, 2 Kings, etc. Even from the first official king in Saul, there was excitement. Maybe this one is going to do it for us. So their hopes would arise after each king, that maybe this next king is going to do it for us. Maybe things are going to be better for our country. Maybe life will get better. Maybe this one will give us all better lives. Well, the problem is that their hopes rose and then were dashed when it said, and so did evil just like his father. That's the story of the Old Testament. Each king would come and they'd get excited and their hopes would be dashed because he would be just as big a loser as his dad was. He'd be just as evil as the one before him, if not worse. And if you look at the entire monarchy of Israel, it's worse. It keeps getting worse. That has brought us to the book of Habakkuk. Because Habakkuk is talking about an exile or a people being taken over. That is the point, is that they are on the brink because of all the leadership rising and falling with their hopes, and it kept getting worse. Do you see any parallel in an election year, 2020?
Yes.
Is your vision 2020, right? Because there's an election and we say, maybe this one will be better than the last one. And just as quickly as your hopes rise, they fall. rise and dash. Maybe you're pessimistic, and then you're hoping a different one comes in with a different outlook, and that one comes in, and one after another, not any better than the one before. Maybe he'll do different evil than the last one. It's kind of how we look at our at our presidential elections. Maybe he or she will do more or different evil than this person. So, just to be honest, this book was written 2,500 years ago in Habakkuk. But in Habakkuk's complaint, what God puts his finger on is that though this was a long time ago, couldn't you have prayed the same thing in the world that you live in? As that the world is not right, and the government is not king. But the point of it is that we need to reflect on in verse 4. He's complaining about the government, but how many of us have too many eggs in that basket? Too much hope, too much dreams in political leaders. Now, Christians should impact the political arena. They should vote, pray, run, do all that they can, so that a biblical worldview will have more say in the governing of us all, because someone's worldview will govern us. Somebody's will. Yes. Don't you want it to be one that is more biblical? So I'm not saying all hope is lost in that arena, but I'm saying it is not our ultimate hope.
That's right.
Right? We argue with other people about it like it is our hope. Like they just called our baby ugly. Like they just made fun of our mama. That's how we have political discussions with people. But Habakkuk's asking God why he doesn't do something about the evil in the world. And his complaint is that the world is not right and that the government is not king. Are you frustrated? If you are, good. It means you're paying attention. So, after all these complaints, here is God's answer in verse 5. He says, "Look among the nations. Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told." So here's what God tells him to do. Right? He's got all this pent-up aggression and frustration and confusion. And here's what God tells him to do. Look at what I'm doing. Look at what I'm doing. He calls him to a perspective shift. That's what he calls him for. Before, he's like, God, why are you making me see all these things? Why are you making me look at it? And here God responds to, look at what I'm doing. Right? Don't look at the world. Look at me. Look at me. But how often do you become fixated on what's broken? Fixated on what's frustrating? Fixated on what's hurtful? As opposed to what God's doing in his world?
Yes.
So here's the answer that God gives to Habakkuk. So the question is, why doesn't God do something about the evil in the world? Well, the answer is, even when it doesn't seem like it, God is fulfilling his sovereign plan. He's fulfilling his sovereign plan. That's what he says in verse 5. He calls the prophet to that shift. And here's the reason that you need to look. the third phrase in verse 5, for I am doing a work in your days.
Amen. Amen.
I am doing a work in your days. Some of us need to be reminded of this very, very simple statement. That God is working in your days. That God is doing something in your life.
Amen.
Because here's the issue. He couldn't see or understand what God is doing. Here's God's response. I am working. So some of us need to understand that very simple fact that God is doing work among us. As John Piper put it, God is always doing 10,000 things in your life, and you may be aware of 3 of them.
That's right. Amen.
Notice how this conversation goes between God and the prophet. It is a conversation between God and the prophet. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, God, if you're real, then why are these bad things happening? See, though Habakkuk is desperate, he never stoops to what the Bible would call folly. Psalm 14:1, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. So though however desperate he may be, he still cries out to God.
Amen.
He doesn't doubt his existence. Because he doesn't stoop into folly. He has a conversation with him. Isn't that encouraging for us? That if you have complaints, you got problems, take them to God.
Oh, yes. Amen.
Take them to Him. That's what you should do. The one who spoke everything into existence and He holds the oceans in the hollows of His hand, He is not emotionally fragile.
That's right.
He is not scared of tough questions. He's not going to dodge them. So you got questions? Good. Good.
Yes. Yes.
We all do, I think. I think there's a lot of things that we all don't know. We all don't understand. We all might be hurt by, a little bit confused. Take them to God.
Yes, Lord.
And when you take your questions to God, know this about Him that we see in the first 4 verses that we looked at of this passage. God is not required to work on your watch or your timetable. God's not required to work on our timetable. He's not. He's not. So the prophet doesn't exchange pleasantries with God. There's no introduction, really. He just goes straight in. He goes, how long am I going to have to keep crying out for this and you're not going to hear or you're not going to do? You make me see the world that's broken and the people in charge that won't do squat. And he goes in like that. This is an encouragement, isn't it? If you felt like you've been praying for the same thing forever. Same thing forever. Don't give up.
Amen.
Don't give up. He is doing a work in your days.
Yes.
It's all according to Him. So, here's the problem, right? God doesn't work on our watch. And secondly, God's not required to work in our ways. Our watch and our ways are different than His watch and His ways. That is what we need to know. Second half of verse 5, what God is doing. It's not something that could have been conceived by Habakkuk. He's like, God, I had this question. He answers it. Wasn't really the answer I was looking for. Being taken over by the Chaldeans, I had one question, but now I have 500 questions. based on your one answer. So here's the thing. God is not one who is us. He's not you. So what happens is when he responds in his ways are not necessarily always our ways.
That's right.
So he's not us, controlled by us. And he's not like us. Right? He's, singing Revive Us Again, oh God, or something like that as a prayer to God. And he goes, we're not going to cuddle on bringing a switch. That's what he's doing. He's bringing judgment on his children here in this verse. So that's why in the end of verse 5, he says, you would believe this if you were told about it. Because it's my plan, not your plan. Because your plan might be believable, it might be tiny, because your brain is tiny. But I got a big old plan and a big old brain that you don't have. And that is what he says. He's asking him to believe the unbelievable. Look at verse 6. Here's the plan. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. Not what I was looking for. Once again, not the question I asked, but thanks for the response. Thank you very much. But God is doing this. Because look at it, it says, I am raising up the Chaldeans. If you skip on down to verse 11, it says the Chaldeans' strength is their own God, not the God of Israel. So that they worship their own strength. So they think they're self-sufficient, but what they really are is a tool in the hand of a sovereign God. As evil as they may be, and as wicked as they might live, they are just a tool in the hand of God.
Amen.
According to verse 7, the Chaldeans made up their own rules. Verse 8, they fed on whatever they wanted, like wolves that hadn't been fed. Verse 9, they gathered captives like sand. Verse 10, they laugh at the authority of the nations as if they were nothing as they take over their land. They laugh at them as they steal their lunch money. That's what they do to everybody. These were terrible people. Terrible people. They played by their own rules, laughed at everybody else's rules, and didn't go by any of it. Yet, this had to mess with Habakkuk. You know it had to. It messes with you. You're like, they're bad, and they're really bad, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take really bad and have them look bad. That's basically the story, right? You got really bad and bad, and a good God.
Yes, amen.
So I had to mess with him. He's revived this place, save our land. If my people who are called, he's probably quoting that. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, then God will heal their land. All right, God. All right, so I heard your prayer, and I'm bringing the Chaldeans. I'm bringing the Chaldeans. But this is a lot like us, isn't it? We're completely in the dark as for our future. We don't know what God's going to do.
Amen.
So when we see a little light or something happens that we understand the next step in a period of things, we might just be more confused than when we started out. We might know less than we did before we figured that out. That's Habakkuk's situation. Because it might not make sense for us that God doesn't work in our ways, and He doesn't work on our watch. Truth is, though, even when it doesn't seem like it, God is carrying out His sovereign planned.
Lord.
Justice was going forth perverted. It was twisted. The Chaldeans were worse than Judah, and God is using the most wicked people available to take over his people. So what we see here in this book, and we'll continue next week even on this, is a call to trust in that sovereign plan of God, even in the midst of frustration.
Yes, yes.
Even in the midst of frustration. That is what we do. So, here's some takeaways for us. This question came to the table, why doesn't God do anything about the evil in the world? The answer is, even when it doesn't seem like it, God is fulfilling his sovereign plan. That's his answer, basically. It's a plan that might not be our ways, it might not be our watch. But Habakkuk's question had a flaw in it. So we've been building off of a flawed premise. There's something broke at the bottom. So if we try to fix that thing that's broke at the bottom, the rest of this bad boy is going to go to the ground. What's broke at the bottom? He's assuming that God was idle.
That's right.
He assumed the inactivity of God. So our takeaway is that we should not take the broken nature and sinful nature of the world as evidence for the inactivity of God. Because he used the Chaldeans as proof that God can use sin. Did you know that God can use all things, including sin? Did you know he used sin? Did you know he used wickedness?
Yes.
He can use it to fulfill his sovereign plan.
Yes, he can. Amen.
Right? Because look at the dual nature of this, right? The Chaldeans just are hungry. They're hungry. On one hand, they're hungry for evil, for wickedness, for land, for property, for people, for killing. They're hungry for blood. God uses this monster on a leash to take over his people who would not repent.
Amen.
That is the message of all the prophets, from the major on to Malachi. God evaluates and says, this is wrong. Repent. If not, I'll punish you. If you do, I'll bless you. That's the message of all the prophets.
Amen.
So here we see that he acts like God's not doing anything. But he is.
Yes, he is.
He absolutely is. So when you look at the world and its brokenness and its sin and its devastation of violence and strife, you see all this out there, it doesn't mean that God's not working in that.
That's right.
He is working in that. Just like he used the Chaldeans' appetite for blood to judge his people, he used it to judge his people, to discipline them. He did not cut them off. He used their wickedness to come down on his people. So, secondly, though the government is not king, this means that God can use wicked rulers to carry out his plan.
Amen. Amen.
That means God can use wicked rulers to carry out his plan. Scripture tells us that the heart of the king is like water in his hands. He's turning it one way, turning it another. He raises up kings, he puts them down.
Yes, he does.
He's the one who does all of this. Thirdly, the world is on a divine timetable
Yes.
that God alone knows and God alone controls. The book of Habakkuk is a call for you to give up control over all the answers. Because you're not going to get them. You're never going to know everything.
That's right.
If you knew everything, we'd change your name. And we'd call you God. But you're never going to know everything, so let's just keep your name the same, okay?
Yes.
And we'll keep his name the same.
Amen.
Because his name is wonderful. So this is a reminder that though there may be the presence of sin and strife in our world, that it's all part of a divine timetable that God alone knows and controls.
Yes.
That's what we see in this first chapter. So let me tell you a little bit about the plan of God. Just like he used the wicked Chaldeans, he used the wicked Romans and the wicked people of Jerusalem. Both of those wicked governments, he used the wicked Jews to yell out, "Crucify him,"
Yes.
on his son. Yet Isaiah 53:6 says, "We all like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord," right, his doing, he's the one that's doing it. "The Lord has laid upon him," being Jesus, "the iniquity of us all."
Praise God.
Isaiah 53:10, "For it was the will of the Lord to crush him." So we use the wickedness into the rejecting hearts of the people of Israel. For he came to his own, and his own did not receive him.
That's right.
He was despised and rejected among men. He was one from whom we hid our faces. So we use that wicked in the heart of man
Yes.
to take his son and deliver them to the Romans, who were the only ones who could legally kill him. He used the wicked Jews, the wicked Romans, and he placed his son on a cross. And while upon the cross, he laid upon him the iniquity of us all.
Thank you, Jesus.
Of us all. Every turn of your head of lust, every burn with desire for greed that you have down in there, every selfish ambition, anytime you raise yourself above somebody else, he took all that and he put it on his son. And it was his will to crush him with it. It was his will. So he raised up these people who did not desire him. He raised up these leaders who had this trial by night, that made false accusations with false witnesses. And then he put him on the tree. And he gave up his spirit. They put him in the ground. And on the third day,
Oh, yes, Lord.
he rose from the dead. He rose from the dead. Over every ruler, principality, and power of the air. You know what God's response is to these wicked governments? Psalm 2, he has set his son on Zion.
Yeah.
He from heaven laughs. And he says, "Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in his way."
That's right.
God's response to all this wickedness in the world ultimately, and these wicked rulers and governments, is his Son, whom they must all bow to or burn.
Amen.
That's what it is. Why do I tell you that? Because you must either bow to that king or you'll burn forever.
Yes.
I love you. I don't want that to happen. I do not want that to happen. You see all this out there? The greatest thing you need to worry about is that sin that's in here. Our biggest problem is not out there. The biggest problem is in here.
That's right.
That you've sinned against God. Sinned against a holy God who dwells in inapproachable light. And your heart is inapproachable darkness and stank. What God did was He loved the world. He gave His Son, who walked among us, lived the one and only perfect life, died that death on the cross for our sin, rose on the third day, now commands us to turn from our sin and trust solely in Him alone.
That's right.
So if you're not a Christian today, bring your questions to the Lord. The biggest question is have you submitted to the Lord Jesus? Is He the one you recognize as God over you? That's the question. So I'm going to pray here in just a moment. Consider this an invitation, right? For Him to make you new.
Yes.
Because the question that he asked was, why does God do something with all this evil in the world? And the answer is that even though you don't understand it, God is working in His world according to His sovereign plan.
Amen.
Revelation 21 verse 5. And He who is seated on the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. You know what He makes new? All things.
Yes.
And your wicked heart is a thing that He needs to make new for you. If you're not a Christian, He can make you new on the inside.
Yes.
That's what the invitation is for God to make you new on the inside. The only thing you bring to Him is your sin.
Yes.
So today, we ask that if you're not a Christian, you need to think along these lines. I'm going to pray in just a moment as our worship leaders come. If you haven't become a Christian, you need to come get me and we'll talk about that. What that looks like in your life. If you haven't been baptized, that's your next step of obedience to the Lord. If you haven't joined the RBC, we invite you to become part of this family of believers with what the Lord is doing here both locally and in the world. So let us pray and respond today.